Hello? Can people hear me? Yeah. So thanks for coming, everybody. Maaza Mengiste was born in Ethiopia, but left when she was 4 years old to escape the violence of the revolution. She is the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze, a story of a family trying to survive and resist during the war years. It was named one of the Guardian's 10 best contemporary African books. She is a professor in the MFA program of creative writing and literary translation at Queens College. Her new novel, The Shadow King, which officially releases on Tuesday, I believe. So we have copies out front, but the official release date is this coming Tuesday, examines the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. She gives us the story from many different viewpoints on both sides of the war. It's really impossible to convey kind of the richness of her storytelling or the variety of characters you're introduced to in this novel without reading the whole book to you, because it seems like on every page there's something happening that's a little bit different than what came before it. But the true heart of this novel is the women who traveled with the Ethiopian troops and rebels and eventually fought besides them. And I'm going to start at the very end of the book. In the author's note, you mentioned your great-grandmother and how you heard about her story later than you heard about your grandfather's story. And what did that story mean to you, and how did it inspire, if it did, this book?
It did. Well, I had grown up hearing stories of a poorly equipped Ethiopian army rising up to confront one of the most advanced military powers in Europe. And these Ethiopians were men charging against the Italian military with outdated rifles. If they didn't have these old rifles, they would use whatever they had, which would end up being spears or swords. And in the end, the Ethiopians kept Mussolini's forces from gaining control of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia remained independent and uncolonized. I grew up with that story, and of course, it's an incredible story. It's rich. It filled me with pride, and it is very hard to be Ethiopian and not understand how much these people who are often very poor, who are often illiterate, who often were just farmers and then dropped everything to charge against the Italians, how much they really sacrificed. I wanted to write that war, the war that I'd been hearing about. But once I started researching, I moved to Rome to start research in the fascist archives because I wanted to understand the history from also the Italian side. And then I started realizing, wait a minute, all these stories that I've heard growing up they were stories of moments of defiance, of heroism, of triumph, but the war lasted for 5 years. That couldn't have happened every single day. So what happened on a daily basis? And if you have stories of bravery, you can't be brave without having experienced terror or fear. You have to overcome something for bravery to mean something, to actually be courageous. So I wanted to find out some of those stories. But then, along the way, I started finding snippets of a headline of a woman enlisting in the military in Ethiopia, of a women's legion coming to Emperor Haile Selassie and saying, we have our Mauser rifles, we will fight also. I started hearing of, these stray threads, and I'm saying, wait a minute. If there are these few women, there have to be more than that. And I said, okay, as a novelist, I can really move into this space. And I started imagining, number one, the things that I was reading in the newspapers, in the archives, in letters that soldiers would write home from Ethiopia to Italy, or what they would write in their journals, would often talk about women who were married to men of power in Ethiopia, the women who were the wives of the military officers in Ethiopia. And what I know about Ethiopian culture is that these households had servants, often had slaves, and when they mobilized everyone. So I was curious about the perspective of the war as it might be told from a servant who may not necessarily have wanted to go, but who was forced to go because of her employers. And also, what would it be like? What does it mean to be a slave and your employer saying, or your owner saying, we're going to war, and that person says, this is not my war. What is my country? And so the book deals with those different voices, right up from the military officers to a female commander, to a servant, to someone who is enslaved.
So, in your great-grandmother's story?
Oh my gosh. And then, so I had been working for a number of years on this story and had really started to focus on a young girl named Hirut, who was a servant in a well-to-do household in Ethiopia, who is helping the military, and her rifle is taken by her employer because Emperor Haile Selassie said, we don't have enough weapons. Everybody has to contribute their weapon. But this was a rifle that was given to her by her father as his last dying act. And she promised him that she would never let it out of her possession. And the war comes, and this man who employs her takes the rifle from her. And that changes Hirut in a way. And she cannot believe that this rifle has been taken from her. She can't believe she's been forced to break a promise. She can't believe she has to do everything this couple that employs her tells her to do. And this begins her first journey into actually becoming the soldier that she will become in the book. She eventually joins the front lines and becomes one of the fiercest fighters in the military. So I was writing this, and at some point had found another photograph of a female soldier. And I was telling my mother, I was in Ethiopia visiting my family, and I was telling my mother this exciting news. And my mother said, stopped me in the middle of telling her this story about Hirut and then the photograph. And she said, wait, but don't you know about your great-grandmother? And I think for a moment, I don't know about the rest of you, but there are things that I wish my family would tell me that they never tell me, and that's never in the right time. And I said, oh my God, it's happening again. And I've been working for years on this book, and I asked my mother, what about my great-grandmother? And she said, well, she was a young girl, and there was a mobilization call that came in 1935. She was married. It was an arranged marriage, but she was much too young. She was just a girl. She was much too young to live with her adult husband. So she was still living at home. She was the eldest of 4 children. The other 3 were her brothers. And when the mobilization call came, which is the eldest of every family needs to come with their rifle and enlist and go to the front lines. Italy is about to invade. She told her father, I'll go. And her father said, you're way too young and you're a girl. Your husband will go. I'll give my gun to him. She didn't like the guy. Eventually she would leave him. But she didn't like him then either. And she said, you will not give that gun to him. And she sued her father for the rifle and went before judges. And they gave her the gun. And she went to war. And that was a story that was so closely mirroring what I was already doing, that it was uncanny. And sometimes I wonder, did I hear this story at some point when I was a child? But it had never been repeated. I'm not sure, and I met my great-grandmother. I met her when she was quite old. She was always this small figure in a room. She was bedridden by that point, but she could command the room, and you could feel like everyone always had stories of her stubbornness and she had a very strong personality. But I never heard this part as much as I could remember. But knowing that gave me concrete evidence that there are more stories of these women that aren't written, that aren't talked about. And I could finish this novel completely confident that I had written the truth.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier Hirut, who is one of the main characters, and she's a servant or a slave to this family when they go to war. And so the commander ends up being the woman who's the mistress of her house, Aster. And they have kind of this, before the war, they have what can only a painful and brutal relationship with each other. You know, Aster beats her at one point. It's terrible. And but then once the war starts, slowly the hierarchy of those social positions starts to erode, and until it seems like they're basically equals, guarding the Shadow King in that role. So I guess can you discuss their relationship and how and the breakdown of that hierarchy between the two of them?
Yeah. You know, with Aster as Hirut's employer, as her mistress, really, Ethiopian society was a society that was completely determined by class, sometimes and ethnicity, but class was one of these dividers of social groups. And if you were born poor in Ethiopia, you stayed poor. There was no upward mobility at that time. So, and there was also this idea that if you were born in whatever class you were born into, it just meant that's what you were supposed to be. So Hirut, being born into this, I guess like farmer peasant society, a family, really believed that that was her station in life, did not understand that she could do anything else. And in fact, at one point, when Aster tells her, you know, you're less than the dirt in my fingernails, she believes it. And she tries to convince herself that's not true because she doesn't feel like that, but that's just how everything is. But when war comes, war disrupts everything. War shifts everything, so that those people who were once your superiors are suddenly being subjugated by other people, now have to defend themselves the way you've had to defend yourself in their household. So Hirut begins to see, wait a minute, here these things are happening to Aster, and I never thought that someone like her could experience that. And if she's experiencing these things, what does that mean about what the Italians will do to me? And she understands that if Aster can be hurt, can be injured in war, what more can happen to her? But she begins to realize the vulnerabilities of these social classes and starts to come into her own. I don't want to give too much away, but really begins to realize how much war disrupts. And in a sense, war gave her some freedom because it gave her the opportunity to do things that she never would do before.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned earlier that they end up as guards to the Shadow King. And of course, the Shadow King is the name of the book.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what is the Shadow King and how it came about.
The Shadow King, when the Italians declared victory in 1936, even though Ethiopia never surrendered. When they declared victory, Haile Selassie left to go to England and begin diplomatic efforts to get more money for weapons, to bring the French and the British and the League of Nations into this conflict to fulfill some of the basic tenets of the League of Nations. Many people in Ethiopia felt that when he left the country, he fled. Some people say he went into exile. There are different verbs that are used. Either he left or he fled. And then those two verbs are a whole political quagmire. But what happened in Ethiopia was it was the first time that an emperor had ever left his people in the middle of a war. In Ethiopian warfare, the style of warfare is very different from Western. in this book, my colonel, the Italian colonel that I've written, is often, he's up on a hill, he's watching his men, he's giving the orders of what happens on the field. I think that's how we know the warfare to be in the West. But in Ethiopian culture, if you are an emperor, if you are a military officer, if you are leading groups of men and women in an army, you better be the first one in that front line. And you are leading that charge. Because if you don't do it, how do you expect the people behind you to do this? So when you are called a leader in an army, that you literally lead them. So when Emperor Haile Selassie left, the entire Ethiopian army, in a sense, was, wait a minute, this is the first time in history in this country that's thousands of years old that this has ever happened. What does this army do? And I imagined the loss of morale, that people, villagers, peasants who were giving up everything, and then they hear the emperor left. So Hirut suddenly has this idea, and she sees this, there's a man in the camp, in their military camp, who is a musician, not a soldier, but he's a musician, and he follows them and does the war horns that startle the Italians and also announce the coming of the army. And she sees that he has an uncanny resemblance to Emperor Haile Selassie. And she said, wait, why don't we dress him up? How will anyone know? So I don't want to give a lot away, but that was inspired by the realization that I think most leaders that everybody wants dead, most of them have had doppelgangers, just in case. And I think Hitler had five or six of them. I found their histories, those poor men. Mussolini had several, and their fates were often tied to whatever happened to these leaders. And I find that also a fascinating history.
Mm-hmm. So, we've been talking about what this story is about, but when you read a novel, a lot of the enjoyment is in the reading experience. It's the structure of the book. It's how it's narrated. And that's what I found so interesting in this book. I mean, I love the story, obviously, but it's not just told straightforward in a way. You give us the stories from the Italian viewpoint, a couple different Italian viewpoints, from the Ethiopian viewpoints. You also have interludes where we get into the mind of Haile Selassie. There are descriptions of photographs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's an occasional chorus that comes in. There are profiles of kind of minor characters that show up. There's a framing device with a prologue and an epilogue that's set in 1974. How did this structure evolve? And I guess, what does it allow you to do as a writer to tell this story?
Oh my gosh. This is a good question. It evolved from many years. This book took many years, and it took a lot. Will Dalrymple makes fun of me because we have a friend that we've made fun of for how long it's taken him to write his book, and he just said to me yesterday, "Oh my God, you took longer than him." But it was a number of revisions. I'm inspired by writers and by work, by films that break structure, that are not necessarily linear. And I was also well aware that history is really nothing more than a series of narratives told and recorded by people who are biased and fallible. They're human beings. So the minute that I had that as the premise, I said, wait a minute, this gives me an opportunity to bring other voices in so that as the story is going, someone else, the chorus, like a Greek chorus, steps in and says, wait a minute, that's not how it happened. Or wait, we need to tell you something else that this character doesn't want you to know. So I was trying to imagine if this were a historical record, let's think about all the oppositions to that and let them come to the table also and tell their stories.
I loved it.
Thank you.
I highly recommend this book. And part of the reason I do so is because the structure is really fascinating. And one of my favorite parts, you go to maybe a handful of times, is what you call interludes. And this is the part with Haile Selassie. And there's one where he's abandoning the capital for another part of the country. He's not leaving the country yet. And he insists to his aide that his gramophone and records must be squeezed into this kind of completely full convoy of trucks and cars. And then you write, we are existing in a moment beyond reason, the emperor wants to say. We are now firmly in the irrational. And I felt like sometimes that sentiment imbued almost all the characters and the action in the book, that you're now beyond reason and irrational. And I wonder if you could address that and how that plays into a war that really makes no sense.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about war as a confrontation. I mean, ostensibly based on what? Ideological differences, maybe this need to grab land, or, so you have these reasons, but then the wars that are decided by human beings that are in their neat offices around shiny tables and clean, their clean environments, then they send other human beings to fight in these things, and it becomes a clash of bodies. And because those people that are on the ground don't necessarily care about ideology, they're trying to stay alive and trying to keep the person next to them living. And it's completely an irrational thing. So I was imagining this emperor grappling with what is happening here, just because, Benito thinks he can come in and take this country, now this is what's happening, and how is this possible? And I was also frankly thinking about living in this here as an American, and every day you wake up and you hear news and you're like, how is this happening? We are firmly living in the irrational now. But it is not new. It's not new, and that is the thing I realized writing this book, that here's Haile Selassie understanding this, and here we are living through this moment, and we all are trying to do something to make our own world rational again, and I think Haile Selassie is trying to do that too with the gramophones, the records, and he insists on listening to Aida, which is his own way of trying to make sense of an Italian mind through opera.
I love that part. I love that detail, because he's trying to understand the Italian's motivation and what kind of people are these. But the music is as important to him as any newsreel is. Yeah. I thought that was really a nice touch in the book, the power of art to really get at the heart of who we are as people. Yeah, and I think,
I think we know, most of us know the story of Aida, and I've loved that opera, and I was writing this book, and it was a diversion. I would go to the opera and watch this, and it was probably about the second time I saw it that it struck me. I said, wait a minute, what is this story? So what the story is the Ethiopian princess is taken during war, basically kidnapped, to go serve as a slave in this Egyptian court, and then she falls in love with the Radames. He's like a military hero, Egyptian. So he's the man that's killing her people, and she falls in love with him? Give me a break. Only an Italian would write that. I mean, this is what Haile Selassie says. I'm quoting him. So I think he thinks, wait, let me break apart this thing, this opera. Is this a way to understand the Italian mind and what they think of us? Did this opera help them think that they could actually invade Ethiopia easily? So that he's trying to grasp some type of rationale in this thing.
It's a great part. It keeps coming up throughout the book.
Yeah, it does.
So you see a photograph up here. Yeah. And I thought we could talk some about photography. Plays a major role in the book. Ettore, who we haven't really talked to, he's the Jewish Italian soldier, has brought his camera to the front. But what ends up happening is he's ordered really to take photos of what his colonel wants him to take. And we as readers realize he's being asked to take photos of atrocities. The Italians are just thinking, oh, this is a nice thing to see. You know, it's kind of what happened during Jim Crow and lynching in America when they would take photos of lynching and make them into postcards. Ettore photos are being made into postcards. And Harut, this is where they kind of combine, becomes one of his unwilling subjects of his photos. But I guess, why was photography such a key piece of the book? And you've talked a little bit about photography earlier, finding a photo of a girl that looked like Harut, you thought, in your mind.
Yeah,
Harut.
yeah, and
So
I'll
maybe you
show
could
that in a minute. Photography has been used to define African people, to define Black people, to find reasons to keep people enslaved or in certain, I guess, classes of society, or to find rationale reasons for colonizing certain groups of people. Photography has been a weapon of these colonizing efforts and of invasions. It has helped to inform a public how to think about other people who are different from them. Mussolini was well aware of the power of the camera. 1935 is really towards the end of the Weimar Republic. So you used to have these big, these huge cameras, and suddenly people could bring these small handheld things to war. So it was really it was the first war that was truly photographed by soldiers on the ground. Mussolini wanted to take advantage of that. And he was sending all of these news journalists over to Ethiopia, to East Africa, to photograph and bring censored images back to Italy. I became interested in these images, but then I started realizing that if soldiers were taking their cameras to war, there were probably a lot of shots that they did not develop maybe in East Africa. They waited till they got home, or they would develop it somewhere and keep the images, and they would not go through censorship. And I became very interested in finding those images, and from those images sprang the parts of the book that you're talking about. This is one of these images that a soldier took, and you can see his shadow here, like he doesn't, whether he realizes it or not. And for me, this image is slightly terrifying, because I look at the person, the man on the left, and how the power dynamics are very clear here. And a man in the presence of two Italians, an Ethiopian, is not going to fare very well, whatever happened after this image was taken. He looked slightly terrified to me. And this, to me, told us an entire story. There are photographs, let me just say very quickly, these photographs that I have been collecting, I am now putting up on Instagram. And you can follow along at the Shadow King novel on Instagram, and these will be coming up on a daily basis, and they have been. So you'll see more of them. But this one is another one that I have found. And when I saw this, I said, oh, I think I have found Hirut now. I think I found her, because I had always written of her in a dress that's just worn out and stained and, clearly old, and it shows her social status here. And so this was one of them that is really one of my favorites. And another image that gave me proof that women were fighters is this one. And this was a woman who enlisted in 1935 when Haile Selassie had a mobilization call. And so she has her rifle, and I can't tell if the ammunition belt is there. But it's a really sweet picture, because all Ethiopians fought barefoot, but she's put her shoes on for the photograph. And so this was, and so more of these are on the Instagram page for the book.
So I would like you to read a passage, because I'd like everybody out here to hear how beautiful the writing is and get a sense of the different things that are happening in this book. So.
Okay. So I have to say also, this is the first time I'm talking about the book since it's out. This is really the first time I've had the hardcover here on stage, and the first time I'm reading this section. So excuse any blunders. I told Arsen I wrote it, but I don't know if I can read it. So let me see. And here goes. Okay. The Aster is a glorious figure astride her horse, Bunna. She has loosened her braids, and thick strands of hair fall against her neck and spread like a dark curtain around her sunlit face. She snaps the animal to a trot across the crest of the hill, her cape fanning around her figure, the golden clasp trapping flints of afternoon light. "Women," she shouts, "sisters, are you listening to me?" Her voice rises into the sky, a blade slicing through the valley below, startling the women from their tasks, forcing them to lift their heads and turn in her direction. "Sisters, are you ready for what's to come?" Ethiopia's gifted Asmari will sing of this day for years, of how the women drop their baskets and their jugs, how they push away their looms and piles of wool. They rise to their feet, nearly in unison, unaware of their own glory, and lift their faces toward Aster's voice. That they pause long enough to listen to the soft tap of distant gunfire is a detail that the songs will repeat again and again. The musicians will make of the women's frowns a forewarning of what's to come. The singers will use the women's gasps and exclamations as signs of their growing strength. One Asmari after the next will sing these words as they play their masinko. That first battle cry was already forming in the women's throats. Aster knew she just needed a way to usher it out. The women were ready but did not know it. There were bullets to be made and gunpowder to mix and rifles to load and enemies to shoot. "Women, those who can make bullets, come to me." Aster's voice carries across the valley before breaking into echoes and scattering into the horizon. She is one woman. She is many women. She is all the sound that exists in the world. The women rush forward, breathless, their steps like the swoosh of leaves pushed by rough wind. Hirut sets down the dried leaves she is scooping into small medicine sacks and watches. Aster descends gracefully from her horse and leads the skittish animal to a nearby tree and tries the rope. As she strides back to the highest point of the hill, she is familiar and strange, someone Hirut has never seen before but has always known to exist. "Do you remember when we learned to shoot with our brothers and cousins?" Aster opens her hand and a hush falls over the women. A few spent bullets rest in the center of her dusty palm, bent and singed by gunpowder. "Hirut, come help me," she adds, looking across the heads of the crowd that has gathered at the top of the hill and spills down one side. Hirut pushes her way through the group, the women so numerous it is difficult for most to see. Aster continues, "We were taught to run through hills and guard livestock, just like the boys in our family. We shouldn't forget these things," she says. "Our country needs us." I'll stop it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So in that passage, there's so many, as you can see, there's a lot of things going on just in that one passage that's so beautifully written. One of the things you jump ahead in time to discuss how the moment will be sung about. So, and this happens a lot. In the narrative, we're kind of aware that we're witnessing kind of the raw material that will become national myths. So in writing is writing a historical novel akin to myth-making, or is it in some ways the opposite by showing us the more complicated and nuanced backstory?
That's a good question. I was striving for the second option. I wanted to look at the scaffoldings of myth-making, to look at all the parts that make history, and then to think about all the gaps that invariably are in between those the rests, the pauses. I wanted to think about what gets emphasized and what gets left alone. And as the Asmari in Ethiopia are similar to troubadours, I guess. They go into bars, and they can, if you've ever been to Ethiopia, they'll sing about you. You'll stand right, and they'll have a song just like that. So these were people who were recording what was happening in battles as much as they were talking about instantaneous moments. And they are to me like a Greek chorus. And I wanted, but they're also a propaganda machine. They're also historians, and I wanted to play with that, with their figure. And for me, what is history if it's not just a series of stories, and there's always more that needs to be told?
Mm-hmm. So when I picked up this book, I really knew nothing about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. I knew the two leaders. I knew the cuisines. Not much. So, as a writer, what do you expect a reader to bring, and what do you feel is incumbent upon you to provide to give historical context?
It's interesting. The war begins from Hirut's perspective. The beginning of the book is from her perspective, and at that moment, she has no idea what Italy is, what is Italian, where is Italy, who is Mussolini, what is League of Nations. She has no idea about this, so the book opens from her perspective of what she knows, and I think the reader learns as she learns, as she moves forward into this. You're aware of more, I hope. And so I understood that readers would not know much. And I have heard numerous times already from people who have read the book that this was a part of history that they know nothing about. And I can understand that, because I think once Hitler stepped onto the scene in Europe, that was it. All the newspaper, the front lines, the headlines were about him. But I have been pulling up the front pages of the New York Times. I just started it, starting from September 11. I've been looking at every day. And if you look, September 11, 1935, front page New York Times, there's Ethiopia. There it is. Every single day it's in the front lines. This was also a pivotal moment for African Americans in the US. In Harlem, Amsterdam News was keeping close watch of what was happening, because Ethiopia represented the fight against white oppression, and African Americans wanted to enlist. They were sending money. It was and James Baldwin mentions Haile Selassie and this war. He was a little boy growing up watching on the newsreel this man and these fighters in Ethiopia. And I think Raoul Peck mentions that in his documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. But again, once World War II really kicked in, Poland was invaded, Hitler took over the front lines, and Ethiopia was left.
Mm-hmm. You provide us a map, right?
Yes.
That's one of the things you felt necessary or important to provide, just to give us some context of where things were happening.
That this happened in a place, that it really did happen, that these villages were obliterated, that it did happen. Yeah.
All right, so I think we're ready to move to some questions from the audience if people have them. So let's start over here with the man with the hat.
Before we do that, I just want to remind everybody, try to keep your questions short, and Maaza Mengiste will be signing her book right outside this room right after this. Thank you.
Could you speak for a minute about the reaction of the Italian soldiers to seeing Ethiopian women soldiers barefoot wearing capes coming at them in battle?
Yeah. I had to imagine that, because I haven't come across the writing of that encounter. But what I have always imagined is that you have these Italians who have this kind of a machismo idea of, well, You don't shoot at a woman, right? You don't shoot at a woman. And what do you do when you have your gun and you realize the soldier coming at you is wearing a dress? I don't know what happened. In my book, they shoot. And then they capture them and do much worse. Because women always have to deal with double war in any kind of confrontation like that. So that was an interesting moment for me when I realized, oh, I have to write this, and how might they have behaved? And I think in the end they behaved as soldiers.
Okay. Question over here.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Maaza.
Hi,
Can you just talk a little bit about the title, The Shadow King? What is that?
Yeah, the title comes from, it could be, you could think of it as this man who became the body double for Haile Selassie. But it's also, I want to go back. Oh God, can I go backwards here? Oh yeah, okay. And I was also thinking about these moments of who is the king, who is the leader, who is the ruler of these moments, this confrontation between soldiers and, maybe a photographer. A photographer works with light and shadow. And who is the king of that shadow? I wanted to subvert images like this and make the people who are often terrorized the ones who are in charge. But also there's a saying in Ethiopia that the emperor is a son, S-U-N, unto his people. And I always imagined that when the emperor then left, when the son left, the country was in shadow. And you have who rises up in that to become a king. And in my head, it's always Hirut. So thank you for asking that. Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Can you speak more to the woman that fell in love with the Egyptian that was oppressing her own people, and like the mechanics of how that happened, or the...
Oh, from Aida?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the opera is available online if you haven't seen it, but it's a love story, it's a romance, and it's really glossed over. There's not much. But once I started reading the libretto of that opera and breaking down the story of actually what was going on there, I became furious. Verdi can do what he wants. I mean, the music is beautiful. I like Verdi. But the story itself is just a very simplified romance and was not even negotiating with anything. It's just a simple story. But I think from the perspective of an Ethiopian who is at war with Italians, maybe from the perspective of an emperor, maybe even from the perspective of an Ethiopian writer, that story is very problematic. So it's still beautiful. I would encourage you to see it if you haven't. I've seen it numerous times. I'll go again, and I always, at some point, I'm like, God, you stupid girl. But it's a simplified. It's just a story that was, and they made her Ethiopian because they wanted to make her exotic at that time, and that was an easy. It was secondhand for exotic.
All right.
Pardon?
Do we have a...
Oh, it's an opera. I mean, but you write a book or you talk about it. Thank you.
All right, we have a question over here.
Could you talk a little bit more about slavery in Ethiopia? And also, did the Italians make any attempt to exploit class divisions in Ethiopia to further their cause?
The really quick answer to your second question, absolutely yes, they did. And they exploited it and made it worse. And then also tried to create other divisions. They were playing groups of people against each other. But in terms of slavery in Ethiopia, it existed. In 1923, for Ethiopia to join the League of Nations, slavery had to be abolished. And Haile Selassie did that. But it was really hard to control what every everybody was doing across the country, and it still was continuing. Families who had enslaved people weren't going to necessarily give them up. The Italians came in promising that they would stop it, but that was just lip service as a way to justify the war. It was eventually completely eradicated, but it was there. Yeah. And it's a really sad part, an embarrassing part of Ethiopian history. When I talk to my family about it, people tell me to shut up. Nobody wants to talk about it, and it's an embarrassment.
Okay, we have another question. You have your hand. You had your hand up for a while in the middle here, and then you were interested. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Maaza.
Hi.
Do you have any thoughts to share about? I was really interested in what you described about how war can liberate people in certain circumstances, and this class system that you described. Any thoughts to share about how that event in history, with all its complexity and things, had an imprint on maybe a lasting imprint on Ethiopian society as a result of things that may have changed since then?
I think I think when Haile Selassie came back in 1941, he was really interested in just maintaining a level of peace in the country because it had so disrupted so many things, getting people, getting lives, getting things to keep moving. He started building schools, which in some way, it was giving people an upward mobility. It started finally happening then. One of his main focuses were hospitals and schools. We need to do this. Send young people who have survived the war overseas to get education so that by the 1970s, you have an entire generation of people who are educated in Ethiopia or at the Sorbonne or at the London School of Economics or wherever, and they were back in Ethiopia working. What the Italians did in during their occupation and during the war was make an effort to eliminate every educated person in the country, and they pretty much succeeded. So Haile Selassie, in building these schools and doing this, was trying to counteract that loss. And it gave people mobility. There were people who were born in these distant villages that could now suddenly go to school, and then next thing you know, they're in France or England or in Addis Ababa or in South Africa, or not South Africa, but in Kenya or somewhere having an education. And this was really momentous.
Okay, I think we had a question down front here.
Hi, I was wondering about translations into Amharic, and I don't know in Ethiopia how many languages does everybody speak Amharic, and also is there going to be a way to get this book in the hands of people who aren't just the educated or more privileged?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. The book, I'm hoping, gets distributed in Ethiopia. I'm not sure yet about translation. Ethiopia has 80 different languages and 200 and something dialects. Distinct languages, but the national language has been Amharic. There's also Afan Oromo and Tigrinya. I'm hoping it gets into some of those. I'm not sure. My dream has always been to, on Ethiopian radio, have parts of this maybe read, or even my first book as a series, serial thing. I'm talking to people and hoping that might happen. And you're right that it's books are for the privileged in many societies, and Ethiopia is no different. But hopefully, when this comes out, I'm hoping, like sometime next year in Ethiopia, that some of that will change.
Okay. Any question here? You got somebody back. Okay, I see you.
I see you have a previous book out there, the one you wrote prior to this. Can you talk about some of the other issues you've written about in other books just briefly?
Yeah, I write about my first book is set in Ethiopia during a revolution in 1974 that deposed Emperor Haile Selassie. This book is a bit of a prequel to that. I went backwards in time, and so Haile Selassie, I imagined him in 1974 in that first book. He appears here also in 1974. But there are also a couple of characters that are in 1974 that are here as young people also, fighting against the Italians. I was curious about what happens to a nation after a war like this, after something so devastating. How do countries recuperate? How do we recover in this country? And I always thought that the 1974 revolution was in some way a continuation of a lot of that ethnic strife that somebody just asked me about. A lot of those divisions in social classes and everything came to fruition in 74.
I think we have time for one more question in the middle here. Well, I think they want you to use the mic for recording purposes.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about some of your challenges with working in Ethiopia with a largely oral tradition, how you went about gathering information, and what were the mechanisms through which the people who were martyred on the front lines, their stories got back? Mm-hmm. And how did you work through all that?
Yeah. The same way I worked through Italian propaganda, which was written down. But you begin to understand there are only certain things that get remembered, and you have to read between the lines to try to figure out what else has not been said. What I realized in terms of the oral storytelling, you hear of the peaks in these moments. It's always the same kind of moment. The moments of heroism, of outwitting somebody, of managing to escape. So-and-so died. I'm not quite sure. Or you'll hear, well, how did he die? We're not sure, but he died. So we know that one person, like for example, a relative of mine who fought, a few of them, I'm not quite sure how exactly they died, but I know that they died at a certain period in this certain location. As researching this, I know the name of that battle. I know the year it took place. I can find out the Italian units that were stationed there. I can figure out the types of warfare some people used mustard gas to completely annihilate. Other people used artillery. I can figure out how they might have done it, and then that way craft what's been left out from the oral storytelling. But and another thing that happens is you're at the mercy of people. When you're relying on any kind of account, you're at the mercy of those record keepers who have already decided for you what should be remembered. Like my mother with my great-grandmother's story, I'm like, how don't I know this? But she just didn't, of course she was happy to tell me, but just it didn't enter her mind that was important. And it takes that, it's a constant work, which is partly why the book took so long. Will's here. So it took a lot of time and a lot of getting out a map, putting in locations, figuring out what was happening, the battles, who's leading, what's going on, and then piecing it together. And then sometimes I was lucky and I would find photographs that had location and date. And that became also part of the creating a world for this.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.